We're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Waste Conversations in May. We have Julie Kearns and Moana Simas with us, and we also have Katrina, our co-founder, who will be interviewing Julie today. So, and before we start the discussion, please tweet your questions and suggestions to us at BWasteWise, or you can also use the hashtag WasteDialogue. And you also have a live chat window on our website, www.wastewise.be, which you could use to send comments and questions. I have a small announcement, actually a big announcement for BWasteWise, which is we have our 2017 Global Dialogue on Waste starting in August 2nd week. And the format will be quite different from what we've had earlier. We'll have about 16 topics and panel discussions in 4 days. And we already have a great list of topics and people coming together for the 2017 Global Dialogue on Waste. So please subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated, and also follow us on Facebook and Twitter and wherever it's comfortable for you. All right, so Katrina, go ahead, please.
Great. Thanks. So I'm excited to talk today to Julie Kearns. Julie is the founder and finder at Junket, which is a reuse store in town here. And I have known Julie for quite a long time. And so I'm excited to welcome you here to Be Wastewise. And we're going to talk a little bit about reuse and what you're doing with the store and how we can kind of, spread this idea that you have a little bit bigger. So I want to start just by letting you introduce yourself and tell a little bit about the story of how Junket came to be.
All right. Thanks, Katrina. And good morning, everybody. It's nice to be with you. I'm Julie Kearns. I am a South Minneapolis single mama, and Junket came to be because of those particular circumstances. I was married and had a brand new baby at the very end of 2008 when life exploded rather unexpectedly, and I found myself in a tough financial situation. And I turned to thrifting to cover my clothing needs. I worked a corporate job. I had, and I lost about 50 pounds through the process of going through stress and nursing a baby and not eating. And what I realized as I was selling my old clothes and buying this new clothes on the cheap was that there was some pretty significant margin to be made via resale. And so that got me thinking I needed to cover my costs. I had a dream of being a single, or basically a mother who could put my daughter and her needs first. And so as this little side gig started to pick up momentum, I decided that I was going to make it everything I possibly could. And from a purpose standpoint, I wanted to have it do as much good as it could in the world as well. And so I wasn't necessarily setting out to start a vintage shop. I was setting out to solve a problem and create ease of access to high quality used goods, because that was the problem as I had defined it. Knowing that was environmental in nature made sense to me just holistically. And about, I don't know, 3.5 years after that purchasing, reselling habit started, I opened Junket. And that was 4.5 years ago now. The store has had a range of iterations during the last 4.5 years. We started as a 2 weekend a month occasional shop in 900 square feet. We are currently a daily shop, operating out of 3,000 square feet. And our next iteration will actually be a slight compression in square footage, because we're welcoming a grilled cheese shop, also social enterprise, into the building. And so we're going to get we're going to practice our stuff reorganizing skills to make room for that, because that's important for our neighborhood. And then a little bit about the shop. We are, basically the premise of the shop is that everything here is either secondhand or made locally using secondhand stuff. For us, local is within 25 miles. We don't want people to be driving around willy-nilly and long distances to get their handmade goods to us. From an environmental standpoint, that doesn't make sense. And now, having done a couple of years worth of work to get our arms wrapped around the data related to reuse and the carbon related beneficial impacts of reuse, we are now beginning to ratchet things up a notch. My goal with this shop is to provide a viable, environmentally sustainable alternative to the convenience shopping experiences that people expect to have in a big box or a convenience store, but to, again, be able to provide access to things that people need and use rather than just fun junk or whatever we find.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to, I think that what you're doing is so distinctly different. I think that many people have had experiences with thrift stores, maybe even with some of the big chain thrift stores like Buffalo Exchange or Savers or these kinds of places, who have a little bit different model and mission. But what you're up to is a little different, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about around the necessity aspect of it. So not just things that people want or that are, going to a thrift store because it's fun and they might get some different styles, but, this kind of aspect of there are things that we actually need in life, and instead of buying those from, somewhere else, buying them reuse. And you've talked a little bit about kind of the paperclip as a good way to understand that. Could you talk a little bit about your paperclip?
I'm happy to talk about the paperclips. You know that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this idea kind of emerged as well, because it ties back into how the business started. And I was again, single mama in with a Saab convertible, and those were my resources. So I didn't have the means to handle a bunch of furniture. I didn't have the means to do the big things. And everyone was telling me who was in this business was saying, but you've got to do furniture. You've got to do big things. And I'm like, no, I'm going to figure out how to handle the small things, because the small things are what no one else is doing. And the small things are the ones that add up, right? There's impact there too. And somewhere, I don't know, 2.5 years ago, as I was sitting in this mess of small things, I'm like, if I could solve this for paperclips, if I could solve this, how do we aggregate them? How do we organize them? How do we, make them marketable? How do we redistribute them? How can we do that in a way that is financially viable, right? That's profitable. If I can solve it for those, I can solve it for anything. And that was the basis, like kind of the rationale for choosing paperclips. And as I started to dig in, it became really clear that I was onto something. Americans buy, according to The Atlantic, Americans buy 11 billion paperclips a year. And a conservative weight estimate of a paperclip is 0.5 gram, right? 0.5 gram of steel. Well, I'm guessing that this audience is pretty aware that steel production contributes mightily to climate disruption, to the global greenhouse gas emissions. And so 11 billion paper clips at 0.5 gram a piece is 5,500 tons of steel. That's about 16,000 tons of carbon dioxide emitted into the air. And that's just paper clips consumed by Americans in 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so that was one that, like, so from a hey, it makes sense environmentally to do it. That has been important. The other piece is we started studying the data around paper clips that has made so much sense to me, and the reason that I feel so strongly about figuring this out is the degree and the extent to which reuse from a paperclip standpoint is environmentally superior, and so environmentally superior to not only new production, but also to recycled paperclips, right? So paperclips made using 100% recycled steel could still travel the same amount of basically for the amount of carbon dioxide emitted during the production of paper clips made using 100% recycled steel. You could put the same amount of existing paper clips on a train in New York, and that train could go back and forth between New York and LA, 15 round trips or 30 individual trips, right? And so we know that, even in a vehicle, in a truck, which we know that vehicles driving around is a problem, right? We've been told that we shouldn't be driving our cars. We're trying desperately to create different versions of cars. We know that those paper clips, pound for pound, compared to the most virtuous manufacturing possible, the recycled materials, could be put on a truck and travel 5 times between New York and LA, right? So well-traveled existing paper clips are an environmental alternative and a far better environmental alternative to new ones, even those made using the most virtuous manufacturing possible. So anyway, I need to figure this out, right? So I'm working on this, and but in the process of figuring this out, we've landed on all sorts of different challenges. How do you get people to buy new paper clips? I'm obviously not going to sell 11 billion paper clips out of Junket. That's not going to happen. So the work has brought me in some interesting places. Really finding a way to help mass retailers reduce their carbon impact would be a great way to do this. So if we can collect them at scale and market them and brand them at scale and put them on an end cap next to traditional paper clips, we're onto something, and it helps the mass retailer. It allows us to actually address, the carbon. Like literally, we can involve humans in being part of a carbon solution by informing and addressing the cognition gap, because that's really a big piece of this too. We're ready to do that work. We just, at this point, there are so many complexities that have kind of led to a solution. What we're excited about is that it doesn't apply to just paper clips. If we can crack this nut for paper clips, we can crack it for safety pins. We can crack it for, metal kitchen tools. We can crack it for all sorts of things. But we wanted to start with something ubiquitous, undervalued, that everybody's using, everybody can relate to, and help people understand that impact. So how's that? That's a lot of information.
You have a really nice graphic about this, I do want to say.
I do, and I wish I had it prepared to share with you guys. Let me see if I can pull that up for you guys. So I've got a couple of them actually. So anyway, but let's continue if that works.
Yeah, I think that that really brings up kind of an aspect that we've talked about before about consumption, and what you're trying to do, it sounds like, with this work is bridging the secondary and primary consumption markets, right? So
correct.
For those that aren't really aware of, how our GDP is measured, we're not measuring all that secondary purchasing in our GDP, which means we're just driving to drive that great economic growth number up and say we're a healthy, growing economy means more consumption.
Correct.
And and so talk a little bit about that, how you view that, kind of that piece of our GDP and the consumption and your role in that.
Oh, goodness. Well, I think a primary role for me is about creating awareness, right? I mentioned a cognition gap. People don't understand how their consumption ties into environment nearly as well as they understand how it ties into GDP, right? Yeah. But one interesting thing worth noting about the GDP is that the GDP does not include any aspect of the secondhand goods industry. It only ties to manufacturing. So it's a flawed measure. I don't know how many billions of dollars this the secondhand market is. I know it's significant. But anytime I have mentioned, hey, we could gradually replace, new goods manufacturing with reused goods redistribution, and that would enable us to scale over time. We hear big concerns about jobs creation, and what does that do? Well, legitimately, the work that is required of this of making secondhand goods available is such that we would not be at a lack for jobs creation. We would be recreating local jobs. In my model, I want to pay artists $15 an hour to pick the good stuff. And literally the people who are able to assess what has aesthetic value, material value, creative value, artistic value, we need people that are paying attention to that in order to produce and provide the best goods possible. That's domestic jobs at scale, right? So I guess that's how I see it. Is it doesn't need to negatively impact our economy. To the contrary, I see all sorts of opportunities if we were to rally around this as a solution, and to enable people, help people good everyday people who see what's going on and want to be part of a solution to empower them to do that. From a supply chain perspective, we've got 10,000 people a day turning 65 in this country, and everybody's trying to downsize, right? And that stuff's all going in the waste stream right now. And that will be the case and the statistic until 2029, when the boomers basically graduate out of retirement, hitting retirement age. And then the other trend that we've got going on is our actual largest generation, right? So the boomers were until, sometime last year, and now the millennials are our largest generation. And that largest generation is choosing to live a minimalist life. Mm-hmm. So not only are they disinterested in what their, parents and grandparents are trying to give away, but they're trying to get rid of all the stuff that they've accumulated as well. Or I shouldn't say all, but enough of it that is adding to the waste flow right now. And even as people are seeking to minimize, I don't know that there's an understanding that means reducing consumption so much as it means, I think there's still some flow through happening with that, where consumption is continuing. It's just swapping out this thing for a different thing rather than just aggregating. So,
yeah. I think that, one of the things that is so compelling about the work that you're doing, both on a personal level and then on a broader level, is tying waste to livelihood. So really looking at this idea that what to one person is garbage is a resource that can empower life.
Yep.
Not just your life, but life on the planet as well. And I think that has roots going back a long way. We've, in the United States, the history of waste is really only 100 years old. And so, 100 years ago, we had people, who relied on other people's waste to make their living. We used waste to feed our animals and, refeed ourselves. And, we didn't have this kind of idea of throwaway. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the educational aspects that you do around that piece, around, literally measuring how much you're turning waste into a resource. So could you talk a little bit about what happens when someone comes into your store?
Sure thing. So the first thing that happens when someone comes into the store, presuming they've come early enough in the morning, we offer them donuts and coffee. So I want the opportunity to engage people at a human level before I ask them or try to teach them anything. So we have a pretty clear script, and it's, hey, welcome to Junket. Have you been in before? And if not, if they say no, how'd you find us? And that's an opportunity for us to draw them into the conversation. And so we make sure they know about the two most important things, which are the donuts and coffee. And then we make a point to let them know what we're about. So, we're everything in the shop is secondhand or made locally using secondhand goods. We have an environmental focus. We're actually working to develop a district of, a sustainable shopping district that, involves a number of other stores. Here's a map to that. Hope you have fun today. And then we, send them off on a two-storied adventure. And so that's the front end. We want them to know that we're friendly and we're excited that they're here. And then when they come to the register to check out, we weigh everything that they purchase. And there's a very specific reason for that. We have, over a year ago, we began working with some really talented guys at a company called Ecotone Analytics. It's a benefit corporation locally, and you can find them at ecotone-partners.com. But anyway, they work with organizations to help them measure their carbon impact. And in most cases, they're working on an aggregate. They're working with organizations that are measuring tons of, product disassembled instead of destroyed or what have you, or helping traditional companies get their arms wrapped around how much bad is currently happening at their expense, basically, carbon-wise. And in my case, we're operating as a carbon sink, and I kind of needed to prove that in order to have any street cred, right? So we figured out a way to start, believe it or not, with a paperclip, and started measuring and weighing all of our product. And then Ted and Tim at Ecotone helped us map the weights and materials to the EPA's WARM data set. And they've also worked to identify other factors for things that the EPA doesn't track. So textiles isn't something that the EPA tracks, but they were able to find some practical indicators elsewhere. The reason that that matters is that we now have data that sits at the front of the register. And as we weigh things, typically people are like, wait a second, that says $2, right? Well, yeah, it's $2, but we're not weighing it for price. We're weighing it so that we have a better understanding of what's happening. And it allows us to enter into a conversation about how their purchase is of environmental benefit, right? So they're getting what they need. And because they're able to buy it at Junket instead of going to a Target or a Michael's to get it, this means that they are indirectly, basically at scale, this would in theory drive down demand for new production, right? If we can have more people doing this, it means that their purchase is not triggering a supply chain that pushes to the manufacture of something in China, right? And invariably, it winds up as just a really interesting conversation. We get to share the data. Hey, last year we kept more than 6 tons of material out of the landfills, and according to the mapping and the data that we did, we had more than 31 metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions avoidance based on that 6 tons of materials.
Yeah.
And so just the opportunity to have those conversations one-on-one is important. And then we're working on having other impacts as well. But typically what we want to do is bring people into the conversation that might not be participating otherwise. Ladies who lunch, who came for a vintage shopping experience, on a Thursday, or someone who just needed something, or they drove by and it looked interesting outside, so they thought they'd stop in, right? Those are people that we're being able to kind of spark awareness. And my goal is over time to reach that tipping point, right, where more people know what's going on than don't, and we can have behavior change set in. It may not happen immediately. We don't know. We see it as kind of planting seeds.
Yep.
So.
Do you think that the neighborhood that you're in, which is very savvy, progressive, and tied, you're really close to the Mississippi River and the parks that are down there, and people in that neighborhood tend to be a little bit more aware of climate change and other environmental concerns. Do you think that makes a difference as far as what you're able to communicate?
Yes. I think that it would be difficult to do this in some communities. And yet, the flip side of that is that we need to be a viable business in order to have those conversations. And so that needs to come first. And so basically, if I show up and I do good in the world, if I show up and I'm creating something that matters, that should create a platform where I can have these conversations. It's definitely easier to do it here because I've got a choir of like-minded people, right? But I also recognize, again, going back to the ladies who lunch or people who come in and shop here. If I make it compelling, if I create the circumstances by which people feel good about participating, I could do it in any range of places, but I think I have a whole lot more luck starting where there's already an audience that wants to hear what we're sharing. Right? So.
Yeah, you mentioned, there's a particular product mix that you have,
yep.
There at that store and that location, and people come, I'm assuming, for that particular product mix, as well as it's a cute store. So you're driving up Minnehaha, you see this cute store, and might want to stop by to participate in that. How do you think the model would be different in less affluent neighborhoods or in more conservative neighborhoods? Have you imagined what product mixes, or what not just the products but the offerings? So you're you're a retailer plus. So you have community space, you have, you know, you mentioned your ladies at lunch. I mean, you offer a lot of opportunities for people to come and hang out and not just come for the retail experience. So have you imagined what that could look like in some different environments?
Absolutely. I think a lot of what we're doing on small scale would translate nicely into other environments. So we have, you know, we do a little free library, and we're preparing to do a street pantry in conjunction with the arrival of the grilled cheese shop. That, you know, and that's actually something that's outside and available to the community. And those sorts of passive outreach where people can choose to participate would do well in neighborhoods that don't have as much going for them as far economically. I think the classes that I would like to do more of here that could matter elsewhere, you know, would having to do with how we can be better stewards of what we do have, or helping people understand the value of what it is that they already have. I mean, that could be more helpful in other communities. I do think that one of the things that's been on my radar is something that I'd like to offer here, but could work elsewhere, is, you know, basically helping people, you know, jumpstart something similar to what I've done. I've offered some talks about how I got started, but it might be, you know, here are some tactical things that you could do to begin doing this. Here are ways that this works. Here's how to break into the market in this way. You know, those are some things that I think would actually allow us to have more impact in other environments. I think with a more conservative environment, because that's a different audience entirely. I do think that we'd probably have to tighten things up a little bit, maybe be a little more subtle with some of our product, because some of our product is kind of, you know, it's a little bit racy. We've got swears on things, we've got social justice messaging, et cetera. And so maybe that's a little more subdued, and the means of having those conversations happens in a slightly different way. But ultimately, we are about drawing others in, and we would figure out how to do that in whatever environment we chose to enter. As I think about multiple locations, I do think about underserved communities. When Junket opened here, it was a blighted, underserved corridor, and that has changed really quickly in the last several years. And we were successful in inviting other organizations, you know, other reuse organizations to join us. And as other businesses already existing along Minnehaha have said, hey, we want to be part of this marketing thing. We want some credit for this. We've been pretty staunch in saying, hey, you know what, if you're engaged in reuse already, that's a no-brainer. We're going to involve you. If you're not engaged in reuse, we'd like to help you find ways to add reuse and incorporate reuse into your mix so that you can participate in the, you know, and reap some of the benefits of the marketing that we're doing from a sustainability focus. That's something that we could replicate elsewhere. So I don't really consider going into the suburbs as a next step. I would definitely consider North Minneapolis or an East St. Paul, or areas that are struggling that could use a boost that comes with a community that gets excited about what's happening.
Yeah. And in your, you know, with your, you know, you kind of your ideas around more of a wholesale model, you know, starting with some obvious things like the paper clip, or other kind of office supplies that, you know, are languishing in many people's drawers at home. Are there other kind of product areas that you've thought of that would be a good fit for a kind of more of a wholesale model?
So we've got, Junket has basically an inventory list of, you know, an assortment that spans 2,700 different items plus at this point. For me, you know, that's, you know, everything from jewelry to creative goods to things that we make and resell. But ultimately, my vision is a supply chain that doesn't currently exist. And that makes it difficult for us to compete with new manufacturers who, at the push of a button, have more product that's matching, that they can manufacture it, will sell over and over again, and their marketing investment is can replicate without a whole lot more effort. And we don't have that right now. So I do see this as being something that we would do, across all sorts of product. We've talked about, crayons. We've talked about other things that parents are instructed to buy for their kids every year, over and over again. Every month we do what we call a reuse drive, where we invite our community to donate something specific to assist an organization that can make good use of what that specific item is. And a couple of months ago, our reuse drive focused on crayons. And we had more than 80 pounds of crayons come in during a 3-hour period. And a lot of those crayons were brand new, right? So this is the sort of excess that we have in our society. And when people understand that they can do good with these things that are, taking up space and creating stress because it's more clutter than they need and it's more stuff in their house, we see motivation and people wanting to add value. And so inviting people and creating a solution by which people can participate and feel good about their stuff rather than feeling crappy about deciding to, jettison it when they get tired of it, would be a really nice way for us to be able to exist. And in some ways it's idealistic, and in other ways we're seeing it happen. So we'd like to facilitate more of that. I don't know if that answers your question so much as...
Yeah, it does. And it kind of gets to, there's two kind of really important aspects of our consumption economy that I think that touches on. And one of them is in the aspect of prevention. So we are, really very familiar with recycling, and that tends to be kind of the number one method that, most Americans at least interact with waste, and kind of realizing that it is a resource, and so starting to move the needle there. But reduction and reuse are actually much more impactful. And so, being able to really activate that reuse stream so that, parents coming into kindergarten, with new kindergartners aren't buying a brand new set of 64 crayons that are frankly never going to get used to their full potential, right? When there are pounds and pounds and pounds of crayons sitting unused all over. So how can we kind of activate that prevention, reuse kind of stream in meaningful ways, making it easy for people to participate in that? And then the second kind of aspect of it is really kind of calling into question our throwaway culture, and that starts to buck up against some of these ideas around how we measure GDP and growth. And so that's a bit bigger of a conversation. And how can we, and I'm going to put this out to Moana as well in your conversation for next time. How can we start to decouple that environmental impact and affluence, or decouple this idea that the health of our economy is only measured in production?
Correct. No, I think that's a great point. And I think, and yeah, that decoupling is on my radar as well. I think that a lot of this has to do with marketing, right? How we have, and acknowledging how we've been marketed to, and acknowledging how things changed from 100 years ago until now around, we've been told that the way to a good life is to buy more, to buy more things, right? That's the good life. But the equation doesn't take into account the environmental impacts or the social impacts of this consumption. So we have a huge opportunity socially to drive a different take on what is the good life, right? Or we get to define what the Joneses are actually, what does keeping up with the Joneses mean? And it's probably time for a massive Joneses reboot, right? Right. But I really think that there's something to be said for people feel there's this huge stigma with secondhand. It's dirty. It's for poor people. You don't do that. It's got germs. It's whatever. And we don't reach those conclusions about buying someone else's house or someone else's car. It's only about the other stuff. And that's a construct, right? That's not that. There's a gap in logic there. And I think we need to be able to take a really good look at ourselves, right? And say, why is it that this is so difficult for us? Whereas this is character and charm and, right? And solid bones, and not to mention so much higher in quality, right?
It makes me think about too, Cracker Jack, the Cracker Jack experience.
Yep.
That secret prize inside. So one of the loveliest aspects of reuse is it's unpredictable.
Right. Exactly. Well, and have you seen some of the work I've been doing with Mostly? When you say Cracker Jack, it's so funny because that's actually how we are approaching the paper clips. It's like if we're going to introduce those in a way that makes sense, it needs to be that unpredictability and the fun. And so as we pack, one of the things I had to solve for was, how are we going to get consumers to get excited about or at least to support paper clips when I'm not going to be sending them 100 of the same size. Right? I can't, like if I have to sort 100 of the same size, that's not happening. So how do we make that exciting? And it was kind of funny because Cracker Jacks is the model. We got to throw something in there that's not even a paper clip and let surprise be part of the thing, right? Do we roll it out with Willy Wonka golden tickets? Right? So how do we create excitement and buy-in, and how do we challenge the notion that secondhand is something to hold one's nose at? Right. And I think we're finally getting to a time socially where vintage is something to be excited about. Right. And environmental and green, and people feel good about it, but they're still feeling good about it from a recreational shopping perspective in a lot of cases. And so that ties back to, how do we make the things that people actually need regularly available?
Yeah.
And that's where figuring this thing out from a supply chain standpoint for paper clips, so that we can do it for so many other things, really comes into play.
Yeah. Cool.
Cracker Jacks.
Cracker Jacks.
I love it.
How do you think other people can learn from your story? Like, what are some of the big takeaways as you've developed your story? What are the kind of big ahas, and what do you think people can learn from those?
Oh, goodness. Well, the big ahas are that, one, oh gosh, you can make it. You can, you're not stuck where you're at, right? If you're doing something you don't enjoy, there are definitely ways to get out of those circumstances. This is one really easy way to do it, and I would recommend finding, if the idea of supplemental income in a way that doesn't do more harm is of interest, this is definitely something worth pursuing. I would say choose something that you know well and start there. Ultimately knowing the value of things, understanding what people value, and understanding what is reasonable is a big piece of this as well. But gosh, there are so many riches to be found in this waste stream. We are the richest country in the history of the world, and the things that are getting thrown away would just astound you. And there's definitely there is money to be made there over and over and over again. So I guess that's, and I say that from a life-making standpoint, not from a get-rich-quick standpoint, because it also is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So profit margin, I saw that pop up here. Here's the deal. Here's where I saw an opportunity initially. And that is that the sale that piqued my interest 7.5 years ago now was a t-shirt that I knew I'd spent maybe 50 cents on, because I was buying by the pound at the Goodwill outlet. And I had brought it to a consignment store, and I didn't know what the consignment store was going to price it at. I just knew that they accepted it. But they priced it at $10, and I got 50% of that, which means I got a $5 check for that t-shirt. Mm-hmm. And having spent 50 cents and making a $4.50 return is a pretty clear indicator of not only the margins to be made, but also the volume that you have to be able to do order to pull it off, right? It is, quite honestly, because of the labor involved. I compare it to the like a traditional retailer, where if you want to put 12 of something on the sales floor, you buy the box, you pop it open, it's got barcodes on it, and you put it there. So 100% markup is viable for a traditional retailer like mom and pop shop. For me, I need to see at least a quadruple return because of the labor that goes into it and the risk that it won't sell. So from a product standpoint, that's that piece of it. Now you need to factor in labor, et cetera. And, it's a little bit tight for me in part right now, actually. And that's partly because I continue to reinvest funding into the research, into, new product development, et cetera. And there is definitely a higher labor cost with this than with other deals. But when it comes to margin on product, at this point, I'd say 50 to 60% of our product is donated to a for-profit institution, because people don't want to throw it away. They appreciate what we're doing and they want to be helpful. Now, it's taken me several years to get to that point, and we're actually now deciding that we'd rather actually go and find and pay for the things that we know will sell quickly than even do the labor to deal with some of that. But that has been instrumental to our growth process, and it's worth sharing that I don't consign things from people who aren't involved actively in the shop and or aren't making these things for consignment. I don't pay people for their secondhand stuff right now at the shop. I will go and find things to supplement, but
yeah. I wanted to talk just about the a tiny bit about what you said is that basically less of the kind of overall cost of the item is going into the actual materials, because they've been paid for a number of times over and over and over again, both financially and environmentally, right?
Correct.
But because it is labor intensive what you're doing, you actually are doing the hard work of creating viable livelihoods, not just for yourself, but for a number of other people.
Correct. Yep, correct. I have a staff. I pay $15 for a full timer, and and the rest of my team are actually consigners here. So they're paid a lesser wage, but also have the opportunity to basically make 100% return on their sales. So that's kind of the trade-off there. And there's more work here than we could get done, in a year at this point. I mean, it's just that's the piece. But when you look back at GDP and the concern about jobs lost, it's pretty much evidence that that's kind of a moot point, or at least from my top-down view, there's plenty of work to be made, or jobs to be created in this industry. So
there are. We have 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
And, we can talk for 2 minutes about how you're growing by shrinking, which I think is also a little bit in that being smarter.
Absolutely. So expansion wasn't part of the game when I had the opportunity to do so about 3.5 years ago. But it was a way to continue the business and allow it to continue to morph and grow. But it was also a way to have some control over the corner and my neighbor when time eventually happened. So we've had 3,000 square feet for the last 3.5 years. And we don't necessarily use the space all that well. The rent has been good. We haven't necessarily needed to. But I wanted, we had kind of a rough, the neighboring tenant had been a problem for the landlord, had been a challenge for us. And so I was pretty clear on what that looked like. So I haven't necessarily been focused on finding the right thing for a second space, but I have been really tuned into the challenges of the neighborhood. And one of those is that there really aren't any good dining destinations for a fast lunch that's family friendly in this part of our neighborhood. And so from a food desert standpoint, it made sense to I've been wanting to bring food to this building for almost as long as I've been here. And we had a really unique opportunity. This past fall, a friend decided to launch a grilled cheese shop on Minnehaha. And when she couldn't find a kitchen on Minnehaha, we started talking about, hey, well, maybe you want to come in here. And so it's an opportunity for us to use our space better, to get better about that. And we know that, if we do a second shop or a third shop, it's not going to be 3,000 square feet. So what better way to basically finesse the model than to downsize, reduce our overhead in the process, and bring in some additional benefit.
Fun.
So yeah.
And fun.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna send it back to Randeep just to wrap up. But a really exciting work you're doing, Julie, and I hope this model can be used by other people and inspires other people and inspires the conversation with Moana a little bit about uncoupling environmental impact and affluence.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Katrina. I enjoyed talking with you.
Great. Thank you very much, Julie and Katrina. And to the audience, I really hope you learned a lot from this discussion and gained some knowledge, which you could then use to create change or become leaders yourselves or support leadership in the environmental and sustainability sector. So thank you again, Julie and Katrina. So now we'll go to Moana, and I'll say goodbye to you.
Thanks.
Great, wonderful, thanks. All right. Let me just do this. This is the first time we're doing this, so let me just hide them and get Moana. Moana, can you unmute yourself?
Hello.
Hey, so, okay, wonderful. So Moana, really excited about this because we have a very easy question for you, which is, how do you decouple affluence and environmental impact?
Okay, first of all, hi everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I wanted to tell Julie that I'm really inspired by her talk, and unfortunately we don't have time to have a big talk about this. I would love to sit for a coffee and discuss all this that has been talked. I have so much to say. And the question on how to decouple environmental impacts from GDP growth and from consumption is definitely not an easy question. So,
all right.
Yeah, how can I go through this?
No, it's not an easy question. I was just teasing with that. So it was just to kind of give a sense of how big all of this is, but also how each one of us could make a difference, and that's how kind of all change kind of happens, when it happens through collective action. So I just wanted to give a sense of how big, what kind of changes are required. But Moana, so do you see the screen?
Yes, I do.
Do you see the chart?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Okay. So
Wonderful.
That's my the nice figure from my paper.
Yeah, exactly. So what I'll do is I'll ask you to explain the chart, and just could you please explain to us what about the paper itself, why you did the paper, and then the chart, what's on the x-axis and what's on the y-axis, what's on the left, what's on the right, and also about the colors here. One of them is lighter, the other is darker. So yeah, please go ahead.
Just giving a small context, the paper that we're talking about is a paper that I wrote together with some co-authors on looking at how different environmental indicators, they correlate to each other and how they're linked to affluence or GDP per capita, economic growth and so on. And what we did, we looked at these, the territorial impacts and the consumption impacts. So the territorial impact is everything that happens within a country's border. So when we look, for example, at the industries that are in a country, or in the US or in Norway, for example, every single industry that are in the country producing either for consumption here or for exports. And when we're looking at consumption, we take a different perspective. We take a more like a life cycle perspective, a supply chain. So we look at every single step for making those products. So from extraction of resources to all the services put, to all the all the labor that went into producing this, and also all the resources that went.
Mm-hmm.
So we get out of looking at the impact that happened within a country's border, but go into what are the impacts that happen throughout the world, throughout all the industries in the world, to make sure that that cup of coffee that you're drinking could be produced.
Right, right.
And,
Yeah, so, that makes sense. So what you've done here is you've looked at all the environmental impacts, and you've taken certain impacts here. You've considered certain impacts, and then you compared it with production.
Yes.
And also with consumption, right? That's what you did. On the left, I think it's the production.
Exactly. On the left is this territorial approach, like every single impact that happened within a country's border. And on the right, the one that's more red, it's the impact related to consumption.
Right.
So what they show is that on the left, you see that there's little correlation. And what I mean by correlation is how coupled those impacts are to each other. So for example, and to each other and to affluence, that's the GDP per capita.
Right.
So looking, for example, at the carbon and materials, for example, is to see like how the carbon emissions in all the countries are correlated to the distribution of material consumption in the same countries.
Right.
You see that from a territorial perspective, like looking at the production in each country, it's not really correlated. So the darker the color red on those squares, the more correlated it is.
Right, right. So on the left, we see that the carbon and the PPP per capita, they are the most highly related because that's the reddest, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And that's especially because of energy. Carbon is, I think that is basically one of the only indicators that really correlate to our, to the level of development of a country. Right. Because the more developed it is, or the more GDP per capita, the more energy it consumes. So it's much more correlated to carbon, but that all the other impacts, for example, the material use, the water, the land use, they're much more correlated to like what this country produces. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, what we saw is that in countries with different development stages or like different levels of GDP per capita, the things that we consume or our lifestyles are much more homogeneous than the structure of the economy. So if we take into account all impacts that are associated to the things we consume, and we look at different countries, we see a growing pattern that the more rich the country, the more all of the impacts, they end up growing. Right. And this is the big challenge that how do we decouple, environmental impacts from economic growth? We can see that from a territorial perspective, it is not that difficult. I mean, with a cleaner technology, or to just shifting the economy from like a manufacturing based to like more service based. So basically shipping the dirty industries abroad. Right. That's easier way, let's say, to decouple environmental impacts from the economy. But when we look at consumption, that's not such an easy question, because the things that we consume, they're still being produced. They're just not being produced here. They're being produced elsewhere. That's right. And this is even worse when all this, shift of production are going to places they have like a dirtier energy mix or more relaxed environmental regulations. Right. Such as the shift from European countries that have like a very strict environmental regulation to countries in Asia and Africa. They're much more relaxed on this. Yes. Right.
So I think this discussion falls into the international happening right now, the climate change agreement, where the developed countries have a huge consumption-based environmental impact, and developing countries are still developing now. Their impacts are really small per capita. And I think that's where I think the argument that's being made generally is that we are decoupling by the developed countries, but actually what's happening is they're still consuming, and all the production, for example, the production was happening in, let's say, in the US earlier, a few decades ago, and all of that emissions would be in their national account. But now they're still consuming the same or even higher amount of resources, but the production is happening elsewhere, maybe in China. Now all the emissions are in China's account, but it's happening because US is consuming at the same level or higher levels. Is that how we can understand this?
Exactly like that. And I think that one of the big problems about it is that, like we show here on this figure, is that the bigger the GDP per capita is, the bigger the environmental impacts associated to it, right? And that's a pattern that can be seen if we plot every single country, or at least every single country that we have in our sample, with their GDP per capita and environmental footprints. It gives quite a almost linear graph. And the big problem is that right now we have 20% of the global population, that's like the developed countries, consuming most of the resources in the world and generating most of the pollution. Like over half of the CO2 emissions happen because of the consumption of 20% of the population. And we see that especially the rapid developing countries, like big countries like China, like India, Brazil, South Africa, they're growing very fast. And that, I mean, their GDP per capita is growing and their consumption level is also growing. And that means that the environmental impact associated to this huge part of the population, they're ascending to middle class and to upper middle class, is likely right now to follow our lifestyles, let's say, of like developed countries like Europeans and the US. And now we have to find a way of changing this, because we can't, it's not sustainable. It's possible while we're few people consuming at the level that we're consuming right now, but it wouldn't be possible when we have most of the world population going into like higher consumption levels.
Right. Okay, makes sense. And so in Julie and Katrina's discussion, they spoke about this quite a bit, right? I mean, about how we are not accounting for all the other stuff, all the stuff that many people seem important to them. For example, housework, or donating to charities, or all the nonprofit work that goes on. Do you have any comments on that? So can you also explain why this research was conducted? I mean, what's the context? Why did you have to compare consumption versus environmental indicators and production versus, why did you have to do that in the first place?
Well, I'm doing my PhD here at the Industrial Ecology Programme, and what I'm looking is the impacts that are associated to international trade. So I'm looking at consumption and lifestyles, but also how all this offshoring of the industries or outsourcing to developing countries are generating bigger impacts on the developed countries' footprints. And that's something that a lot of consumers, not that they're not completely aware, but that people don't really think about it. For example, in Norway, most of the electricity comes from hydropower, and Norwegians, they see themselves very environmentally friendly. Like they have really low impact, but in terms of consumption, they are one of the dirtiest countries in terms of environmental footprints per capita, because the consumption levels are too big. And I think that what we need to talk about here is how to avoid not just consumption, but how to shift the consumption into less environmental, into things that have like lower environmental impacts, to services, to secondhand goods from thrift shops, for example, or basically changing the way we consume. But also have to change the way that we measure economic development, because just measuring it by economic growth means that we will never ever be able to grow.
Right.
And by growing, we'll have to make new things, right? That's how the economic theory works right now. And I guess that this is a question that Julie was talking a lot about. Like that's how we measure GDP, and this needs to change. And the way that we measure economic development needs to change, because we can't just grow forever.
Right. So this actually, this discussion actually reminds me that I should mention 3 different publications. One is a book called Somebody Else's Problem, Consumption and Design. It was written by Robert Crocker from Australia. I've been reading that book and I've been enjoying it a lot. And the second book is Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. She's a UK-based author, and she talks about how existing economic theory needs revamping completely. And also a publication in Nature, which I think back in 2012, which said that population growth and consumption are the 2 main drivers which change everything else around the world. All the other global drivers. And given that human development continues as it is, then there are predictions that the population will peak at a point in future. I mean, there are multiple predictions, but then all predictions say that it'll peak if human development continues. So then what then happens is consumption kind of becomes the important problem that we should solve, assuming that human development keeps progressing like it is right now. So do you have any thoughts on that? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
Associate that with the paper.
Yeah, so I've been conducting some research lately, and that's the research that I'm doing right now, is looking at those drivers for the environmental impacts, and looking at the contribution of technology change, of trade, international trade, and all this outsourcing of production between countries, and also of consumption per capita and population growth. And actually what you see is that the richer the country, the less that population matters, and the more that consumption per capita matters. And actually recently, the growth in consumption per capita outweighs population growth as a driver for emissions, especially greenhouse gas emissions and energy use, because we have lately a big part of the world, like especially China, India, in some sense, a lot of people are getting out of poverty and going into more consumption markets. So there are more people going into middle class in the last decade that, ever before, basically. And then you have like this huge part of the population just starting to consume. And what's happening is basically they're like trying to mimic what we see. What is the desired lifestyle that we see on?
Yeah. Actually, I have when it comes to the developed world and the developing world, and I think a lot of people from the developed world do kind of like consider themselves as the problem for the consumption, when it comes to mimicking the lifestyles. But I actually, being someone from developing country perspective, I actually think it's people looking at the developed world and then considering this as a good life. Everyone wants a good life, comfortable life. And therefore, this being a model, not trying to mimic, but just, trying to have a good life. And the models that are out there are mostly Western models for a good life. So, yeah.
They're like our reference point. Yeah.
Right. So, and I think with this, we should end the discussion because we are almost 20 minutes. But thank you, Moana. Do you have any final words to say before we go?
Well, I think that going back to the first question that you asked, like how we need to find ways to decouple, and I guess that we need to shift the question a little bit of like, what do you want to decouple from? Do we want to decouple environmental impacts from human development, from socio-economic development, or for economic growth? I think that's the main question that we have to look right now. We have to stop looking at just economic growth in terms of GDP growth, but we have to look at what we want to decouple from. What do we want? What is our goal? Yeah.
I totally agree. I think that's an important question that all of us should address. And I'm really glad that your conversation and the conversation earlier kind of like, kind of just shows how important it is that we address these challenges now. So with that, thank you very much, Moana, and thanks to everyone who's been watching us live. The video will be online and it will be available for free. And please follow us on BeWasteWise on Twitter, Facebook, and also subscribe to our mailing list because we send a newsletter which is only 4 updates, doesn't take too much of your time every month. So we really pick the most important updates for you. Again, in 2017, the 2017 Global Dialogue on Waste will be starting in August 2nd week. We have a great list of topics and people coming together, and the theme will be collective action, because I think it's really important that we talk about that at this point in time in our history. So thank you very much, and have a good day, good night, and good evening, wherever you are.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.